Welcome to Pure Nonfiction, the podcast interviewing documentary filmmakers. I'm Tom Powers, the documentary programmer for the Toronto International Film Festival and artistic director of Doc NYC. On this episode, I talked to Liz Garbus about her new Showtime series, The Fourth Estate. Her camera crews followed the New York Times reporters and editors covering the Trump administration over its first year. We get to know the personalities behind the bylines. Here is White House reporter Maggie Haberman.
When I was growing up, my father worked at the New York Times, and I saw the news business as sort of something that consumed and didn't really give back in a big way. But I just fell in love with the sort of exquisite adrenaline rush of reporting on a story.
Garbus, along with her co-director Jenny Karchman and their crews, started filming on Trump's inauguration day and kept going as the Russia collusion case unfolded and the White House went through many upheavals. It's like watching all the president's men in real time. We witness how it takes a team to tell the story. In this clip, Maggie Haberman and her colleague Glenn Thrush hammer out an article on the resignation of Press Secretary Sean Spicer.
You'd figure having 12 cups of coffee I'd be able to focus. Mr. Spicer has agreed to stay on for a month. Mrs. Sanders, she's still not a Mrs. to me, though. She's Sarah, right? Including Mrs. Sanders, we're said to be. We can't say she cried, right? She did, though.
She did. Why wouldn't
Can we say that?
Why wouldn't we say that? It's true.
And reacted. That's a little sexist, isn't it? When told
Why is it sexist to say
she would be taking over the top job immediately.
Yeah.
Can you look up Scaramucci for me? I think Scaramouche is a kind of a character in, like, opera buffa.
Isn't it with Mouche? It's like M-O-U-C-H.
Yeah, operatic
Stock
Mouches.
clown character of the Italian commedia dell'arte.
Name a stock character in Italian opera.
Garbus has many documentaries to her credit. She's been Oscar-nominated twice for What Happened Miss Simone, about Nina Simone, and The Farm, Angola, USA, about prisoners serving life sentences. She previously appeared on Pure Nonfiction Episode 5. Last week, I hosted her in front of a live audience at the IFC Center. We had just watched the pilot episode of The Fourth Estate. I asked her to explain how she pulled this project together in such a short time between the election and Inauguration Day.
After the election, I was thinking about how to use my voice to help make sense of this new political landscape we were facing. And a lot of different things kind of came to me, and nothing felt quite right until one day, it was about 2 weeks after the election, the president-elect was going to make the rounds visiting the major news organizations, which I've since learned is an unusual thing to do, but he wanted to go around, go meet with the CNN brass, go talk to the folks at the New York Times. And he started on a Twitter tirade about canceling the meeting with the New York Times that he had set up, 20 minutes earlier because they had changed the rules. And the New York Times responded, in their sober way of, the rules weren't changed and the meeting was going to be on the record, and we sort of we stick by that. And then he sort of, there was another tweet storm, and then okay, I'm going to the meeting. And on that day, it clicked for me that his relationship with the press and the press's relationship with him was where I wanted to be. And that's where the idea was born. And then there were a series of things from me sitting on my desk obsessing over Twitter to actually, being able to turn on a camera on January 20th. That had to happen. But that's where it started.
So what was that conversation with the Times like? What were the questions they had for you to grant you this extraordinary access?
Well, there were many conversations. First, I reached out to a friend of mine who's a journalist, a writer for the New York Times Magazine. That's where it started. He said, maybe, who knows? But he introduced me to Sam Dolnick, who is an assistant managing editor there, who was kind of in charge of leading the Times's charge into its digital, potentially multimedia future. He was working then on launching The Daily, their podcast. And so I guess there was a desire to think outside the box about how the Times would reach people. And even though I was never pitching, that I was going to do this for the Times, I mean, it's clearly an extension of their reporting. So then he listened and, he understood what filmmakers needed, and he thought that maybe Dean Baquet would be receptive. And then I went to meet with Dean Baquet, which was, pretty exciting and interesting. And I was surprised I'd gotten that far. And Dean was kind of like, I get it. It's a good story.
And do you already have in mind that you're going to follow for a year and do it episodically, or what were you pitching?
No, I mean, at that time, I was kind of like, what can I get? I was like, what will they put up with? Is it anywhere from, the first 100 days, which would have been one kind of thing, very different, but one kind, which is basically what you see here. But, as I'm sure this is the first of 4 episodes. So this is just a quarter of the film. It's just beginning. But I also did feel that, my experience as a documentary filmmaker tells me you got to stick around for a while for people to stop noticing you all the time. And certainly a year felt like, okay, I can do that. and maybe it was a manageable enough amount of time that they would not be scared off by such an ask. But in terms of whether it was going to be a feature film or an episodic film, they didn't really care. They weren't involved in that level of kind of creative brainstorming. And I didn't know until probably a month or 2 into it that I really I had real access. There were a number of characters I wanted to follow. The stories were rich and deep and complex and exciting. And then I wanted to do many hours.
Well, it's one thing for Dean Baquet and the management to say yes, but you are dealing with all kinds of maverick reporters here, and covering some of them like getting up in the morning with their kids, and so what was that process like? Not only getting the upper management involved, but securing buy-in from each individual that you want to intrude on their careers.
Intrude. We had the blessing from on high, as you said, but it was up to every individual reporter whether or not they were going to open themselves up to us. And we had a variety of, responses. And people changed their minds and their feelings about us over the course of the year. Some people were very comfortable with cameras and kind of agreed right away, and others were kind of standoffish, and still others were sort of ambivalent, which was
Who
kind
was
of the
standoffish?
Who was standoffish? Well, for instance, Mike Schmidt, who you see in this episode just as part of a meeting, who's now, his over the course of the year, if you followed his byline at the Times, he's had some of the biggest scoops of the year where he's broken the story where Trump asked Comey for his loyalty on Flynn, and that Comey wrote these memos. And just the other day, the Mueller questions for Trump, just scoop after scoop. And he was standoffish, and then by a couple months in, he agreed, and he's kind of a star of the
Near the later episodes, he really shined.
Yeah, and that's all I'll say for now.
Okay. So the cinematography in this is something I think we take for granted, but your camera crews, they're really in there. They're covering difficult scenes. I wonder if you can draw out for us, some of the craft that's at work there. Maybe if there's a scene or something, whether one that we saw in this show or in a different show, that exemplifies what the cinematographers are doing in this series.
Yeah, I think it took us a little while to figure out what our language was going to be, because in the beginning it was just like there was a lot of run and gun. We're just getting access, things are happening, you're going to go. But then as we were able to kind of, establish our footing and have access sort of arranged and have more of a process, just from a production point of view, if people in the audience are filmmakers, one of the biggest challenges was knowing, when to shoot and frankly when not to shoot. There was so much happening. So we worked out with some great cinematographers, a collection of them that we'd sort of have them on retainer, and they would trade so that they were constantly available for us, which was really the only way to make a film like this. And we established certain ideas around what we wanted this to look like and feel like. And in the New York Times, there's a lot of glass. There's a lot of closed-door meetings behind glass. Transparency is obviously a theme. So we played with a lot of those ideas in terms of guidelines of how to shoot. We wanted to shoot even when people weren't, we weren't able to hear them. We wanted a lot of close-ups so sort of played with some of those guidelines because there were different people in the field working with the cinematographers, and they had to have a unified language.
Well, along those lines, I also want to ask you about the editors. There's a group of editors who are credited, but across the 4 episodes, there is a kind of uniform pacing to it. And so can you describe how you set that tone with the editors, like having lots of people working on it, but making it feel like it's all the same theme.
So, well, I mean, I want to acknowledge Dallas Rexer, who's here, who is one of my story producers. I don't know if other crew is here. Other people who worked on the film are here, but I know Dallas is. I see her. I mean, we worked with a team of not just Jenny Karchman, who was my partner in the field and I'm producing, but story producers Dallas and Nell Constantinople and a group of editors. And there was a lot of sharing of scenes. A lot of hands got onto different episodes. We did start cutting episode 1 first, and it did set a tone for the entire rest of the film. And there was a lot of handing back and forth of scenes and working in the style of the first episode that you saw.
When did you understand that the Russia investigation was going to be such a central through line of this story?
I understood pretty early on that was going to be a really interesting place to be. I mean, it really, could feel like a Jean Le Carré novel often, and it's kind of, it's like it is. If it weren't a real life, it would be a juicy mystery novel. Unfortunately, it's real life, and so, but it was a really interesting place to be. And the kind of difficulty, the White House correspondents are working every single day. They're covering the administration. There's always someone with the president. And that has a kind of constancy and predictability to it. With the investigative journalists, there was so much that was unpredictable but incredibly exciting to follow. So we knew pretty early on that those were some of the journalists we really wanted to pursue.
So in the course of this year, one of the journalists, Glenn Thrush, winds up making news as part of the Me Too reckoning that was happening. You deal with it in a later episode. Can you describe, what it was like when you became aware of that as a thing?
Well, Glenn, is someone we were following, and even more so in episode 2. We spent time with him. I went to Hamburg with him to the G20 summit, and he was someone we got to know. And when you're making a film about someone, about different people, you know them and often like them. And so it was really surprising and upsetting to hear that there had been these women in his prior jobs that had felt harassed by him and were harassed by him. And then as a story, it was incredibly interesting because, of course, the New York Times broke the Harvey Weinstein story, which relates to the Trump story in terms of the energies behind it. And then it comes back to affect one of their star White House correspondents. So as a story, it was very interesting. But from a personal level, it was upsetting. It was very disappointing.
The Times' reporting on Harvey Weinstein does come up a little bit in a later episode, and at some point that must have felt like the gravity of the paper was shifting in that direction. Was there a moment where you thought maybe we should be making another film about this, or?
Well, no, definitely there was a period of time in the Times where, that was clearly the biggest story, and it is still having reverberations culturally. But we knew that the Trump politics story was important and complex enough that, and that story is complex enough that you couldn't just kind of like, oh, we're just going to go over there and start shooting over there. But it does, very much relate back to Trump. I mean, I think that the fact that somebody who spoke the way about women that Trump did and who had allegations of impropriety in his past, and that person went on to be elected president, I think it angered and emboldened people to come out against other harassers in their lives. So it did reflect back. So in as much as it reflected back on our core story, we wanted to cover it. But certainly it was one of the biggest stories of the year, if not the biggest story of the year at the Times.
Watching these 4 episodes, I get so caught up in just my own interest in watching good journalists at work. But I have to say it was a little hard when the 4th episode came to an end and I knew that there wasn't going to be any more. There are endless stories coming out of the New York Times. Is there a chance for a season 2?
Oh, it's very hard for us. I mean, my colleagues who worked on this film to not be in the newsroom. It feels like we feel a little astray. So it's hard. I think we will do something more with the Fourth Estate. I don't know exactly what form it will take. We're figuring it out. But certainly the story's still moving forward.
That's good to hear. I mean, I know that Showtime also does the Circus series, and they've done a second season of that. So we can hope. Yeah. This pilot episode had its premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival a couple weeks ago. I know a lot of the people in the film were there. What was that experience like? What have their reactions been?
Well, it's interesting. So the one ground rule that the Times set when I asked to roam around their halls with cameras and recording equipment was that they would have the opportunity before we locked or delivered the film to vet it for any sourcing information that we might have inadvertently revealed. Sometimes it's very obvious if somebody's talking to a source and there's a name, we would erase that footage right there on site, but there could be things that we didn't know. So they did have an opportunity to screen it before, and the journalists themselves had to screen it because it would only really be them who could really pick up on nuances of revealing sources. So that was a really stressful experience. I've often shared films with subjects before they've gone out into the world as a courtesy, so they're prepared emotionally. But this felt a little different, and that was hard. I mean, and they respected the boundaries. So they had seen it before Tribeca. But I think that there were some hard things in there. I think that they are pretty used to being exposed. I mean, all of these journalists, basically, when they write an article, they're attacked. So they've got pretty thick skin. So I think at the end of the day, they felt like their dignity was on display, and that the process, that they're so careful and serious about their process. So they felt, I think that they, it's not a blanket statement, but many of them felt that it was a very truthful depiction of what their days are like.
I think in our current media cycle of, this happened, headline, that sometimes it's hard to get a big picture of what's going on, or you can be so distracted by the crazy tweet that went out this morning, or the person who's just been fired, and that phenomenon comes up in a later episode where some of the journalists are talking about we need to be covering policies and how those policies are impacting people. I wonder for you in telling this story if you felt that tension between the drama of who's in and who's out versus the kind of tougher to tell story about how policy affects the lives of Americans.
Yeah, no, we grappled with that a lot, and I think, if you set a filmmaker loose in the New York Times, you could come back with, look, they do 300 stories a day, so you could come back with a whole bunch of different films, and we had to apply a lens to this. Like, we had to focus, because otherwise it would be all over the place. There had to be characters that you would return to. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of, there are a lot of characters who are not in the final film. There are a lot of shoots we did out in the country which are not in the final film. We did focus on Washington. I think that in some ways that's a limitation, right? We're not, but we're also not claiming to be a film about everything that happened this year. I mean, that would be a very different film. And I think, in terms of foreign policy and North Korea and Iran, I mean, there's so many tentacles. So we had, we did focus on Washington and politics. And, I know there will be a lot of other films on a lot of these other issues.
I want to thank Liz Garbus for speaking with me. Her 4-part series, The Fourth Estate, is now streaming on Showtime. Thanks to our team, series producer Sarah Moto, sound mixer Tom Micah, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. I invite you to listen to our short-form podcast, Documentary of the Week from WNYC. You'll find over 160 documentary recommendations. Pure Nonfiction is distributed by the TIFF Podcast Network. You can read our show notes, learn about live events, and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.